Lucy had always known that some people felt entitled to take what wasn't theirs, but she had never expected to encounter that kind of arrogance so close to home, so personal, so direct. It started with small things that seemed too trivial to fight over, things she told herself weren't worth the stress, the arguments, the endless back and forth that would only add more frustration to her life. But the problem with entitlement is that it grows. It feeds off silence, off hesitation, off the assumption that no one will push back. And for Karen, it was exactly that, an assumption that Lucy wouldn't, or maybe couldn't, fight back. Lucy had lived in the neighborhood for years, long enough to know which of her neighbors were polite, which ones were indifferent, and which ones liked to think the world revolved around them. She had seen Karen around before, always loud, always making sure people noticed her, making sure her presence was acknowledged. Karen wasn't the kind of person you could ignore. She had a way of invading space, of dominating conversations, of making everything about her. It was exhausting, but Lucy had no reason to interact with her until the day Karen decided that the handicap parking spot outside Lucy's apartment complex belonged to her. At first, it was occasional. Karen would pull into the spot with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no in her life. Lucy had assumed it was a mistake. Maybe Karen was running inside quickly, maybe she didn't see the sign. She gave her the benefit of the doubt once, twice, even 3 times. But then it became a pattern. Every morning, Karen's car was parked there. Every afternoon, it was still there. And by the time Lucy would return from work or errands, exhausted and just wanting to get inside without struggling, she would have to park farther away, making the already frustrating process of getting out of her vehicle and into her wheelchair even more of a challenge. The first time Lucy confronted her, she kept her voice neutral. She didn't want to fight, didn't want conflict. She just wanted to point out that the spot was legally designated for people with disabilities. Karen had laughed a short, dismissive sound, the kind that made Lucy's blood run cold. "Oh, come on," Karen had said, waving a hand. "You don't need it all the time, right? I'm just parking here in the mornings. It's not a big deal." Lucy's hands had tightened on the wheels of her chair, but she forced herself to keep her voice calm. "It is a big deal. That spot is there for a reason." Karen had sighed, dramatic and exasperated. "Look, I'm in and out. I run errands. I have places to be. I don't see why you're making this a thing." Because it wasn't a thing to her. Because she had never once had to think about what it was like to struggle to find a space wide enough to get a wheelchair out safely, had never had to factor in extra time just to get inside her own home. To her, it was just a convenient place to park, a luxury, an option. To Lucy, it was necessity. After that, Karen stopped pretending it was a misunderstanding. She made it a game. Some days she would park in the spot and wait just to see Lucy struggle. Sometimes she would stand by her car and watch, arms crossed, smirking. Other times she would make comments, little jabs disguised as jokes. "Maybe you should get one of those motorized scooters, huh? Then you wouldn't even need a car." Or, "You're pretty strong for someone who needs a special parking spot. Maybe they should test people before they just hand out those placards." It was infuriating. It was humiliating. But more than anything, it was exhausting. Every day the same fight. Every day the same smirk, the same arrogance, the same reminder that to people like Karen, the rules didn't apply. Lucy went through the official channels. She filed complaints, called the building management, even spoke to the local enforcement office about repeat violations. But Karen was always one step ahead, always had a new excuse, a new way to twist the situation. "Oh, I was just dropping something off. I was only there for 5 minutes. It's not my fault she's making a huge deal out of it. Well, I didn't see her using it, so why should it matter?" And because Karen knew how to manipulate situations, how to play innocent when needed, the warnings never amounted to anything. The worst part wasn't just that she kept getting away with it. It was that she enjoyed it. She knew she was making Lucy's life harder, and that was part of the fun for her. Lucy had never been the kind of person to let people walk all over her, but she had also learned, through painful experience, that some fights took more out of you than they were worth. She had hoped that if she ignored it, If she showed that she wasn't going to engage, Karen would get bored. But people like Karen didn't get bored. They escalated. One night, Lucy came home late, exhausted after a long day of work. She had spent hours at the hospital where she volunteered, helping train therapy dogs for disabled veterans, a cause close to her heart. By the time she got back to her apartment, she just wanted to sleep. But Karen's car was in her spot. Again, something inside Lucy snapped. She was done being polite, done trying to reason with someone who had no interest in reason. She pulled out her phone, took pictures of Karen's car, the license plate, the sign that clearly marked the spot as reserved. Then, instead of calling the management, instead of calling the city, she called a tow truck. Karen had always assumed Lucy wouldn't fight back. She had assumed wrong. When Karen stormed outside 20 minutes later to find her car being hauled away, the fury on her face was unlike anything Lucy had ever seen. She was screaming, demanding, threatening, but for the first time, Lucy didn't care. Because Karen was about to learn that entitlement had consequences. Karen had always believed she was untouchable. She had built her entire life around the assumption that rules were merely suggestions, that people were too afraid, too polite, or too exhausted to stand up to her. She knew how to push limits, how to manipulate situations, how to make herself the victim whenever it suited her. But that night, as she stood on the curb watching the tow truck pull her car away, something in her carefully curated world cracked. It wasn't just the inconvenience of losing her car. It was the humiliation. The fact that she had lost. The tow truck driver, a stocky man in his 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, barely gave her a glance as she ranted. "You can take it up with the impound lot," he said flatly, tightening the last strap securing her car. "You can't do this," Karen shrieked, her voice bordering on hysteria. "This is harassment. I'm going to sue. I'm going to have your job." Lucy watched from her balcony, her fingers clenched tightly around the railing. She had expected anger. She had expected screaming. But the sheer rage in Karen's voice sent a chill through her. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. This was personal. Karen spun around, her gaze locking onto Lucy. "This is your fault," she shouted. "You think you're so smart? You think you've won?" Lucy didn't answer. There was nothing to say. That night, Karen made it clear that she wasn't just going to accept the consequences of her actions, she was going to retaliate. The first sign came the next morning. Lucy's car, which had always been parked neatly in her designated space, was covered in scratches. Deep, jagged lines carved across the driver's side door, the kind that couldn't have been accidental. The realization hit Lucy like a punch to the gut. Karen had done this. There was no doubt in her mind. She took photos, documented everything, and called the police. When the officer arrived, a tired-looking man in his 40s, he took one glance at the car and let out a slow sigh. "You got any proof?" Lucy's stomach tightened. She had circumstantial proof. She had the long history of Karen's harassment, the fact that her car had been towed the night before, the fact that Karen had explicitly blamed her for it. But that wasn't enough. The officer gave her a sympathetic look. "File a report. If you catch her on camera next time, we can do something. Next time." The words rang in Lucy's ears long after the officer left, and there was a next time. 2 days later, she woke up to find that someone had dumped a full bag of garbage across her doorstep. Not just trash, rotting food, coffee grounds, and something that smelled like spoiled milk. It was deliberate, malicious. She cleaned it up in silence, refusing to give Karen the reaction she wanted. Then came the phone calls. For 3 nights in a row, her phone rang at odd hours, always from a blocked number, always dead silence on the other end. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning. Lucy had dealt with bullies before. She knew their patterns. They started with control with small power plays, then escalated when they felt threatened. Karen was unraveling, growing desperate to reassert her dominance. But Lucy refused to back down. She reinforced her security, installed cameras outside her door and by her parking spot. The next time Karen tried something, Lucy would have evidence. And Karen did try something. One evening, As Lucy wheeled herself toward her car, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow near the far end of the parking lot. Someone crouching low. Her pulse quickened. Karen had no idea that Lucy had already anticipated her next move, that she had set up motion-activated alerts, that her phone had already captured footage of Karen crouching beside her vehicle with what looked like a knife. Lucy called the police before she even confronted her. By the time the officers arrived, Karen was still there, caught in the act, her face twisted with fury as she realized what had happened. "This is a mistake," she shouted as they questioned her. "She's setting me up. She's trying to ruin my life." But the evidence didn't lie. The officers didn't arrest her that night, but they issued a formal warning, and for the first time, Lucy saw something flicker in Karen's expression: fear. She had spent her entire life pushing people, bending rules, getting away with things because no one had ever forced her to face real consequences. But now she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. And that's when Karen did the one thing Lucy didn't expect. She stopped. No more vandalism. No more phone calls. No more harassment. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. For the first time in months, Lucy started to believe that it was over. She should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She had simply changed tactics. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucy heard a knock at her door. A soft, deliberate knock. Not the aggressive pounding of someone angry, but the kind of knock meant to lure someone into a false sense of security. She checked the peephole. Karen stood there, smiling. It wasn't the usual smirk, the arrogant sneer. This was something else. Calculated. Cold. Lucy didn't open the door. Instead, she spoke through the wood. "What do you want?" Karen's voice was smooth, almost friendly. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," she said. "I'd like to talk." Lucy didn't trust her for a second. She kept the chain lock in place, cracked the door just enough to see Karen's face. "There's nothing to talk about." Karen's smile didn't falter. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Lucy's heart pounded. Karen was many things, but remorseful wasn't one of them. This wasn't an apology. This was something else. A setup. A test. She didn't take the bait. "Glad to hear it," she said coolly, then shut the door. Through the peephole, she watched Karen's expression shift. The mask slipped for just a second, revealing something dark, something ugly. Then, just as quickly, the smile returned. "See you around, Lucy," she said softly. Lucy locked the door. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, she felt it. Dread. Because Karen wasn't done. She was just getting started. Lucy had faced hostility before. She had dealt with condescending stares, dismissive remarks, even outright cruelty. People who assumed that because she used a wheelchair, she was somehow weak, someone to be pitied or ignored. But she had never encountered anyone like Karen, a woman so deeply entitled, so venomously obsessed with control, that she refused to accept even the smallest consequence for her actions. The vandalism, the harassment, the veiled threats, it had all been a performance, an attempt to wear Lucy down, to make her break. And now, standing in the quiet of her apartment, listening to Karen's footsteps fade down the hallway, Lucy realized something chilling. Karen wasn't going to stop. She wasn't just angry about her car being towed. That had been a spark, but the fire was something else entirely. This was about dominance, about forcing Lucy to submit, to make her regret ever standing up for herself. It was no longer about a parking space. It was personal. Lucy reinforced her security. She changed the locks, double-checked her cameras, even made sure the maintenance staff knew not to let anyone into her unit without explicit permission. She wasn't paranoid, she was prepared. Karen wanted a reaction, wanted to prove that she could shake Lucy's foundation. But Lucy wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. She went about her life as normally as possible, refusing to acknowledge Karen's existence whenever they crossed paths. For a few days, nothing happened, and then things got worse. It started with small inconveniences, things that were easy to brush off at first. Packages she had been expecting never arrived. The delivery service confirmed that they had been left at her door, but when she checked, they were gone. It's a mistake, maybe. An accident. But then it happened again. And again. Important letters went missing. Bills she had never seen before arrived with overdue notices, and twice her internet mysteriously went out for hours at a time while her neighbors had no issues. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Lucy knew exactly who was behind it. She filed complaints, talked to management, but without hard proof there was nothing they could do. Then came the noises. At first they were just odd sounds in the night, scraping against the walls, faint tapping at her door, things that could easily be dismissed as pipes or settling wood. But over time they became more deliberate. The knocks at her door weren't random anymore. They came at specific times late at night, just when she was about to fall asleep. A slow, methodical rhythm. Knock, knock. She stopped opening the door. She stopped acknowledging it. She knew Karen was trying to unnerve her, to push her into reacting, into showing fear. But she refused to play along. She wouldn't let Karen win. But then Karen changed her tactics. One evening, just as Lucy was returning home, she noticed something off about her apartment door. The lock was scratched, as if someone had tried to force it open. Her stomach twisted. She checked the security footage immediately, expecting to see Karen lurking outside her door. But the footage was gone. Not just corrupted, not just a glitch deleted. Someone had tampered with her system. Her blood ran cold. She reported it immediately, but again there was no solid proof linking it to Karen. She could see the skepticism in the officer's eyes as he took her statement. They didn't say it outright, but she knew what they were thinking. No forced entry, no evidence. Maybe she had imagined it. That night, Lucy didn't sleep. And that's when Karen made her next move. It was raining, one of those relentless downpours that made the world feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Lucy had just finished a late shift at work and was making her way to her car when she saw something that made her stop cold. Her tires were slashed, all four of them. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, her pulse hammering, searching the empty parking lot for any sign of movement. But there was no one, just the faint flicker of a street lamp, the distant hum of traffic. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and snapped pictures. Documented everything. This was beyond harassment now. This was calculated, personal. She called the police again, but she already knew how this was going to go. Sure enough, when the officer arrived, he asked the same question. "Do you have proof of who did this?" No, of course not. But Lucy knew. She felt it like a weight in her chest. Karen was sending a message. And Lucy finally understood. Karen wasn't just trying to scare her. She was trying to isolate her. She wanted Lucy to feel trapped, to doubt herself, to reach a point where she would do anything just to make it stop. But Karen had underestimated her. Lucy wasn't just some passive victim. She had spent her entire life fighting, pushing back against the world when it tried to tell her what she couldn't do, what she wasn't capable of. And she wasn't about to let some petty, insecure woman break her now. So she did something Karen never expected. She fought back, not with threats, not with retaliation, but with strategy. She reached out to a lawyer, not just to file a complaint, but to start documenting everything properly, every police report, every missing package, every incident. She spoke to her building's management, made sure they understood that if they continued to ignore the situation, they would be legally liable. And she didn't stop there. She hired a private security consultant. Not some ex-cop with a badge complex, but someone technical, someone who understood how to counteract the kind of subtle, insidious tactics Karen was using. The consultant set up redundant surveillance, hidden cameras Karen wouldn't think to look for, motion sensors disguised as everyday objects, remote backups Karen couldn't tamper with. Lucy wasn't just reacting anymore. She was building a case. And when Karen finally slipped up, when she finally got too confident, too sloppy, Lucy would be ready. But Karen wasn't done escalating. Not yet. And the next time, she wasn't going to settle for slashed tires or missing mail. The next time, she was going to make sure Lucy felt truly helpless. Lucy had always believed in preparation. She wasn't reckless, wasn't the type to let herself be caught off guard, but nothing could have prepared her for what Karen did next. The vandalism, the harassment, the psychological games, it had all been leading up to this moment, and Lucy could feel it in her bones. Karen had pushed and pushed, and when Lucy refused to break, she had taken it as a personal challenge. That was the thing about people like Karen, they couldn't stand losing, couldn't handle the idea that someone had outmaneuvered them. They had to win, no matter the cost. And now Karen was getting desperate. It started with the locks. Lucy had just returned from a late shift when she noticed something was wrong. Her key wouldn't turn. At first she thought she had grabbed the wrong one, but when she tried again, applying more pressure, she realized it wasn't her mistake. Someone had jammed the lock. Her stomach twisted. She glanced around, scanning the dimly lit corridor outside her apartment, her nerves on high alert. No sign of Karen, no sign of anyone, for that matter. The building was quiet, too quiet, like the entire world had gone still. Lucy clenched her jaw, refusing to let the panic set in. This was just another game, another tactic to get inside her head. She took a slow breath, pulled out her phone, and called the locksmith she had saved in her contacts weeks ago because she had known something like this would happen. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't going to let Karen force her into a corner. It took the locksmith an hour to arrive. An hour Lucy spent sitting in her hallway, her back against the wall, watching the door like it might swing open on its own. She didn't let herself think about what would have happened if she had come home later, if she had been stuck outside in the middle of the night, unable to get in. When the locksmith finally got the door open, Lucy stepped inside and felt an instant, suffocating wave of unease. Something was off. She wheeled herself forward slowly, eyes scanning every inch of the space she knew so well. Nothing was obviously disturbed, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But she felt it. An absence of something. A shift in the air, like someone had been here and left without a trace. Then she noticed her kitchen drawers. They were slightly open, just a fraction, but Lucy never left them that way. She was meticulous, careful, organized. She had to be. And yet, as she moved closer, she saw that every single drawer had been cracked open, just enough to be noticeable. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Karen had been inside her home, not to steal, not to break anything, just to remind Lucy that she could. That was the worst part. The message was clear: you're not safe. I can get to you anytime I want. Lucy called the police. Again. They arrived an hour later, took her statement, looked around, but there was no sign of forced entry. No fingerprints. No cameras had caught anything. They asked if she was sure she hadn't left the drawers open herself. She stared at them in disbelief, fighting the urge to scream. She could see it in their faces, the polite skepticism, the doubt, the exhaustion of officers who had dealt with too many cases without enough resources. One of them sighed. Look, I believe something happened, but without evidence, there's not much we can do. Maybe consider changing your locks again? Maybe a security system? Lucy wanted to laugh. She already had a security system, and it hadn't done a damn thing. When the police left, she sat in her apartment, feeling the walls close in. Karen had crossed a line. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a violation, an invasion of her home, her sanctuary. And Lucy knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't over. She barely slept that night. Every creak of the building, every distant sound made her skin crawl. She kept the lights on, her phone beside her, her mind racing with the possibilities. What was Karen's next move? What was she planning? The answer came 3 days later. Lucy had been wary, hyper-aware of everything, double-checking locks, glancing over her shoulder every time she left her apartment. But nothing had happened. Karen had gone quiet, too quiet. The silence stretched long enough that Lucy started to wonder if she had finally scared Karen off, if maybe this was the end of it. Then she saw the flyers. At first, she didn't register what she was looking at. Just a stack of papers taped to the entrance of the building. Dozens of them, plastered across the lobby, the mailbox area, even on the elevator doors. People were stopping to read them, exchanging confused looks. Lucy's blood turned to ice. She pushed forward, dread curling around her ribs, and froze. The flyers were about her. Big, bold letters at the top read exposed the truth about Lucy Kramer. Below that, a picture of her one she had never seen before, taken from some odd angle, like it had been snapped in secret. And beneath the photo, a list of vicious, fabricated accusations. Fakes her disability to get special treatment, used fraud to get her apartment, scams the system for benefits she doesn't deserve, violent, unstable, harasses neighbors. Lucy's breath hitched. People were still reading, whispering, staring at her. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she tore one of the flyers down, her fingers trembling. This was Karen's next move. If she couldn't scare Lucy, if she couldn't force her into submission, she was going to destroy her reputation instead. Lucy turned sharply, her eyes scanning the lobby, searching for her. And then, just as she expected, she saw Karen standing near the mailboxes, arms crossed, watching her reaction with a slow, satisfied smirk. It took everything in Lucy not to lunge at her. Karen tilted her head, feigning concern. Wow, Lucy. People are talking. I mean, I don't know who put these up, but yikes. Lucy's fingers tightened on the flyer. You did this. Karen widened her eyes in mock innocence. Me? No, I'm just as shocked as you are. But hey, if people are asking questions, maybe you should take a good look at yourself. Maybe you're not as untouchable as you think. Lucy felt rage unlike anything she had ever known. This wasn't just a petty game anymore. Karen had taken this to a new level, a dangerous level. But what Karen didn't know, what she had never even considered, was that Lucy wasn't going to take this lying down. She wasn't going to retreat, wasn't going to let herself be bullied into silence. Karen wanted war? Fine. Lucy would end this. Lucy didn't react the way Karen wanted. She didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't run to management with shaking hands and tears in her eyes. Instead, she went silent. Not the kind of silence that signaled surrender, but the kind that came before a storm. The kind that meant she was calculating, strategizing, preparing for the next move. Karen had made a critical mistake. She assumed Lucy would break under pressure, that the lies on those flyers would spread, that people would turn against her. But the truth was, Lucy had spent a lifetime proving herself. She had fought harder than anyone to maintain her independence, to carve out a life for herself in a world that often viewed people like her as weak, as incapable, as burdens. And Karen thought some cheap, desperate smear campaign was enough to destroy that? No. Lucy had been patient. She had waited while Karen played her petty games, while she escalated her tactics bit by bit, testing how far she could push before Lucy pushed back. But this wasn't a game anymore. This was war. She took down every single flyer, not in a rush, not angrily, but carefully, methodically. She didn't rip them, didn't leave shreds behind for Karen to sneer at later. She gathered them into a neat stack, took them back to her apartment, and laid them out on her table. Then she started making calls, her lawyer, a private investigator, a few contacts in local media. Because if Karen wanted attention, if she wanted a fight that would spill out beyond the walls of their apartment complex, then Lucy was going to give it to her. But Karen wasn't finished yet. The next night, just past midnight, Lucy woke to a sound. Not the usual knocks, not the distant hum of late-night traffic, but something closer, something inside. Her breath stilled. She sat up in bed, listening, every nerve on edge. There another sound. A creak, so faint it could have been nothing. Could have been her mind playing tricks on her. But Lucy didn't take chances anymore. She reached for her phone, tapped open the security app connected to the camera she had hidden after Karen had tampered with the first system. And then her stomach turned to ice. Someone was inside her apartment. The camera in her living room, the one disguised as a standard motion detector near the ceiling, had captured it, a shadow moving just beyond her bedroom door. She didn't hesitate. She called 911, her voice low, controlled but firm. She gave her address, explained the situation, and then waited. Minutes passed. the longest minutes of her life. And then footsteps. Retreating. A door closing. The apartment door. She checked the feed again. The shadow was gone. By the time the police arrived, there was no one there. No forced entry, no sign of a break-in. But Lucy knew. Karen had been in her home. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't a slashed tire or a stolen package. This was a violation on another level. The police took it more seriously this time. A report was filed. An officer lingered for a while, patrolling the halls, checking the entrances. But without concrete proof, without a face on the footage, Karen wasn't going to face consequences. Not yet. Lucy didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment, hands clenched, mind racing. Karen wanted to prove that she could do anything she wanted. That Lucy was powerless. That she could invade her space, her safety, her very sense of security, and that Lucy wouldn't be able to stop her. But Lucy had spent her whole life adapting, learning how to survive in a world that didn't make room for her. And she wasn't about to stop now. The next morning, she went out, moving with the kind of calm that only came from absolute resolve. Karen was waiting for her, of course, leaning against her car, sipping coffee, smirking like she hadn't just broken into someone's home the night before. Lucy didn't acknowledge her. She wheeled past, heading straight for the building's security office. Because while Karen had spent the night trying to scare Lucy, Lucy had spent the night gathering evidence. Karen had slipped up. She had forgotten about the hidden cameras in the hallway, the ones Lucy had personally installed a week earlier, positioned in a way that caught just enough. Not a perfect shot. Not enough to show her face clearly, but enough to prove that someone had entered Lucy's apartment. And the building's security footage? That would fill in the gaps. She presented everything to management, calmly, professionally, with a lawyer on the phone line the entire time. And suddenly, they were taking things a lot more seriously. Karen was called into the office that afternoon. Lucy wasn't there, but she could imagine how it played out. How Karen must have tried to deflect, to lie, to twist the situation the way she always did. But this time she was cornered. By evening, a formal complaint had been filed against Karen. A restraining order was in motion, and the cracks in Karen's facade were starting to show. That night, Lucy expected retaliation, expected something loud, violent, messy. But instead, Karen went quiet. No more games, no more knocking at odd hours, no more staring from a distance with that smug little smirk. And somehow, that made Lucy even more uneasy. Then, 3 nights later, Lucy woke up to a loud, piercing alarm. For a split second, she didn't understand what was happening. And then she smelled it. Smoke. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm, to move. She grabbed her phone, pushed herself out of bed, wheeled herself toward the door. The fire wasn't in her apartment. It was coming from the hallway. She called 911, her voice urgent but controlled. They were already responding. Someone had pulled the alarm, the fire department was on the way. And then, through the thickening smoke, she saw it. Something had been shoved against her door from the outside. A piece of furniture. A heavy planter. Something designed to slow her down. Her pulse roared in her ears. She turned, wheeled toward the window, weighing her options, her escape routes. And then sirens. Firefighters bursting into the building. Voices shouting. The barrier was pushed away, the door forced open, hands grabbing her chair, pulling her to safety. As she was rushed outside, gasping in the fresh air, she caught one last glimpse of Karen, standing in the crowd of evacuated tenants. Watching. Expression unreadable. And Lucy knew. Karen had tried to kill her. This wasn't just a power struggle anymore. This wasn't about a parking spot or some petty grudge. This was an attempted murder, and it was the last mistake Karen would ever make. Lucy sat on the curb outside the apartment complex, her lungs still raw from the smoke, her hands clenched into fists so tight that her nails dug into her palms. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to calm the rage burning beneath her skin. The fire had been small, controlled, started just far enough from her apartment that it wouldn't spread too quickly but close enough that it would trigger the alarm. It was a warning. A message. a final move in a game she had never agreed to play. Karen had been escalating for months, pushing the boundaries further each time, testing just how much she could get away with. And now she had crossed the last line. Lucy had always known this was leading to something bigger, something worse. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't thought Karen would be bold enough, reckless enough, to actually try to trap her in a burning building. She stared at the flashing lights of the fire trucks, watching the firefighters pack up their gear, listening to the murmur of the crowd that had gathered to gawk at the scene. The fire had been put out quickly, the damage was minimal. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Lucy could have died tonight. She took a slow breath, steadying herself before turning to the police officer standing nearby. He was young, maybe early 30s, with the kind of weary look that came from years of handling too many complaints that never led anywhere. She had seen that look before. She already knew what he was going to say before he even opened his mouth. "We'll investigate," he told her, his voice professional but disinterested. "But unless we find direct evidence linking someone to the fire, there's not much we can do right now." Lucy let out a hollow laugh. "You think this was random?" The officer hesitated. "No, but proving it is a different story." She knew what that meant. She knew how this worked. Karen had always been careful. She never left a trail, never did anything that couldn't be explained away with a smirk and a half-hearted excuse. Lucy had proof of the harassment, the vandalism, the stalking. But attempted murder? That required something undeniable. She turned to her lawyer, who had been standing quietly beside her, his expression grim. "Find a way to make this stick." He nodded. "I'll do everything I can," but Lucy wasn't about to leave this in anyone else's hands. For too long, she had been reacting to Karen's games. She had been waiting for the right moment, hoping that someone else would step in and put an end to it, but hope had never gotten her anywhere. She wasn't going to wait for another attack, wasn't going to wait until Karen found a way to push her even further. This ended now. The next morning, Lucy made her move. She didn't go to the police station. She didn't file another report that would sit at the bottom of a pile of unresolved cases. She went straight to Karen's apartment. Karen wasn't expecting her. The look on her face when she opened the door was almost comical, a mix of surprise and amusement, as if she had won and was waiting to gloat. But Lucy didn't give her the satisfaction. She didn't waste time with words. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and shoved them into Karen's hands. Karen's smirk flickered. "What is this?" Lucy's voice was steady, deadly calm. "Everything." Karen glanced down at the papers, flipping through them. Police reports, documentation of every single incident, copies of restraining order requests, security footage. Her fingers froze on that last one. Lucy saw it, the way her breath hitched just slightly, the way her grip tightened. Karen had thought she was untouchable, had assumed Lucy would never be able to pin anything on her. But she had been sloppy. "The building's security cameras caught you sneaking into the hallway before the fire started," Lucy said evenly, watching Karen's face closely. "And the maintenance guy? He saw you moving the planter in front of my door." Karen blinked, just for a second, but Lucy saw it. The fear, the realization, the understanding that she had finally lost control. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. She scoffed, tossing the papers onto the kitchen counter like they were worthless. "You don't have anything solid. You know that, right? Even if they suspect me, it won't hold up in court. And you know it." Lucy smiled. And that was the moment Karen knew. Because Lucy wasn't bluffing. She picked up the papers, stacked them neatly, and then looked Karen straight in the eye. "You have two choices," Karen's smirk returned, but it was forced now, stretched too tight. "Oh, this should be good." "You can fight this," Lucy said. Her tone matter of fact. "You can go to court. Watch this turn into a full-scale investigation. Watch your entire life unravel piece by piece. Because I will make sure you lose. I will destroy you." She let that sink in for a moment before she continued, her voice soft but unyielding. "Or you can disappear." Karen's breath caught. Lucy didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She saw the exact moment Karen understood what was happening, what was really happening. This wasn't just a legal threat. This was an ultimatum. Because Lucy wasn't just going to take her to court. She was going to ruin her. Karen had spent so much time believing she was the one in control, believing that she could push and push and push without consequences. But she had never once considered what would happen when Lucy pushed back harder. For the first time since this nightmare had started, Karen didn't have a response. She just stood there, staring at Lucy, processing the weight of her own mistakes. And Lucy let the silence hang between them before she turned and wheeled away, her heart pounding but her resolve solid. She didn't wait for Karen to argue, didn't wait for another pathetic attempt at manipulation, because it didn't matter. Karen was done. By the end of the week, her apartment was empty. No announcement, no goodbyes, no dramatic exit. Just gone. Lucy didn't ask where she went. She didn't care. She sat outside that evening, feeling the breeze against her skin, listening to the sounds of the city without the constant weight of tension pressing down on her. No more vandalized property, no more missing mail, no more fire alarms in the middle of the night. Just peace. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. She had won. The silence felt unfamiliar at first. It wasn't just the absence of Karen's constant presence, the lack of her smug expressions, the disappearance of her whispered taunts in the hallway. It was something deeper, something Lucy hadn't realized she had been carrying for months, a tension so ingrained in her daily routine that, even now, weeks after Karen's departure, she sometimes caught herself waiting for the next act of sabotage. But it never came. Karen was gone, and with her the exhausting cycle of harassment, fear, and vigilance had ended. Lucy had confirmed it the day after Karen vanished, not because she wanted to gloat, but because she needed to be sure. She had asked the building manager casually, as if it was just another passing inquiry if Unit 4 billion had been rented out yet. The response had been quick, almost dismissive no. She moved out suddenly. Didn't even take half her things. Just paid off the lease and left. There was no forwarding address. No explanation. Just an abrupt departure that told Lucy everything she needed to know. Karen had finally understood. She had been cornered, outmaneuvered, stripped of the power she had spent so much time wielding over Lucy's life. And rather than face the consequences, she had done the one thing she had spent months trying to force Lucy to do. She ran, and that should have been enough. The victory should have felt complete. But in the days that followed, Lucy found herself restless, uneasy in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The apartment was quiet. The parking lot was clear. The neighbors, once cautious and distant, had started offering her hesitant nods of acknowledgement, as if finally recognizing what she had endured. Yet something still sat heavy in her chest. Because while Karen was gone, the scars of her presence remained. The scratches on Lucy's car were still there, deep and jagged reminders of every petty act of cruelty Karen had inflicted. The security system she had installed, the second, hidden one, the one that had finally caught Karen making her fatal mistake, still blinked in the corner of her apartment, a constant symbol of the paranoia she had been forced to live with. And every now and then she would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, expecting to hear that slow, deliberate knocking at her door. She hated that Karen had left those marks on her, not just the physical ones, but the ones buried deeper, in the spaces of her mind that had once felt safe. She hated that even now, even with the certainty of Karen's absence, a part of her still braced for the moment when peace would shatter again. So Lucy did what she always did. She took action. She started small, fixing what had been broken, erasing the remnants of Karen's presence bit by bit. The first thing she did was get her car repaired, watching as the last of the damage was buffed away, as if undoing the vandalism could undo the memory of it. Then she deep cleaned her apartment, scrubbing every inch, opening windows, letting the air feel new again. She replaced the locks again, not because she needed to, but because she refused to let Karen's invisible presence linger any longer than necessary. And when all of that was done, she did the thing she had wanted to do for weeks, but hadn't allowed herself to believe she had truly earned. She parked her car in her space. For months, she had avoided it, even after Karen left, even when there was nothing stopping her anymore. It had felt tainted, like claiming it back would be some kind of challenge to the universe, daring it to bring Karen back into her life. But that was ridiculous, and she knew it. The space was hers. It had always been hers. So that morning she pulled into it with deliberate ease, stepping out of her car like it was the simplest, most natural thing in the world. And as she locked the doors behind her, she let out a slow breath, steadying herself against the quiet knowledge that this was over. At least that's what she told herself. 2 weeks passed, and life settled. The tension in her body began to fade, her mind gradually releasing the grip of constant anticipation. She started sleeping through the night again. She started making plans, real plans, things she had put off because she had been too consumed with simply getting through the day. And then, one afternoon, she received a letter. It wasn't official. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't anonymous. It was from Karen. She hesitated before opening it, half expecting some final attempt at manipulation, some parting shot designed to claw its way under her skin. But as she unfolded the page, her eyes scanned over words she hadn't expected. It wasn't an apology. Not really. Karen wasn't the type to apologize, not in the way normal people did. But it was acknowledgement. I guess you got what you wanted. I left. Like you told me to. Maybe that makes you feel powerful. Maybe it should. I don't know why I cared so much about making your life miserable. Maybe I just needed to feel like I was better than someone else. Maybe I didn't think you'd actually fight back. But you did, and I lost, and now I have to. Live with that. Lucy stared at the words, fingers tightening around the paper. I don't expect you to care, but I'm trying to figure things out now. Maybe I needed to lose. Maybe I needed someone to show me I wasn't as untouchable as I thought. I don't know. But I won't come back. You don't have to worry about that. There was no signature. No indication of where Karen had gone or what she was doing. Just those words hanging between them like a bridge that neither of them would ever cross. Lucy sat there for a long time, rereading the letter, feeling something unexpected stir in her chest. It wasn't pity. She would never pity Karen. But it was closure. The kind she hadn't expected. The kind that made her feel lighter, just a little. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in the back of a drawer, not to keep as some kind of sentimental reminder, but because she wasn't going to let Karen have any more space in her life. Not in her mind. Not in her home. She had won, and winning meant moving forward. That night, she sat on her balcony, looking out over the city, breathing in the quiet, no fear, no waiting for the next attack, no weight pressing against her chest. Just the steady, undeniable knowledge that she had taken back everything Karen had tried to take from her. And for the first time in a long time, Lucy was free.